It was an ordinary day at the royal palace, yet there was a sense of excitement in the air. The sun was shining brightly, casting golden rays over the centuries-old stone walls, giving everything an almost magical glow. The palace, with its grand architecture and lush gardens, seemed alive with its own energy, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. Inside the palace, the staff moved quickly, preparing for the day's events. The kitchen bustled with the scent of fresh pastries and brewed coffee. Servants scurried through the hallways, making sure every room was in perfect order. The royal family was always the center of attention, but today King Charles was at the heart of it all. There was a certain rhythm to his daily routine, a set of familiar movements and rituals that the palace staff knew well. King Charles had spent most of his life in the public eye, his every move followed and analyzed. Today was no different. His appearance would mark the beginning of a special occasion at the palace. As the king prepared himself for the day ahead, the palace staff could feel the weight of his presence. Even the smallest details of the day felt important. King Charles was known for his composed and dignified manner, but he was also a man who appreciated tradition. Every day without fail, he took a short walk through the palace grounds. It was a simple moment, yet one that carried deep meaning. This was his time to connect with the history of his family, to walk in the footsteps of his ancestors, and to remind himself of the responsibility that came with the crown. For the king, it wasn't just a routine walk, it was a time of reflection. He would stroll through the meticulously landscaped gardens, nodding at the staff he passed, exchanging pleasantries with those who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. The royal guards, standing at attention near the gates, were part of this daily ritual. They were always impeccably dressed, their uniforms pressed and their boots polished to perfection. For years this had been the way things were done. The guards would salute as the king passed by, and he would nod in acknowledgement, a brief but meaningful exchange of respect. Today, however, there was an added layer of anticipation. There was something different in the air. Perhaps it was the knowledge that today's walk would not only be another ordinary stroll, but would also be part of a more significant event that was to unfold in the coming days. Whispers of it had been circulating through the palace corridors for weeks. A major announcement, a royal declaration that was bound to make headlines. But for now, King Charles was focused on the present moment, determined to keep to his usual routine. His walk had always been something of a public spectacle. Those who gathered outside the gates to catch a glimpse of the king could always count on seeing him pass by, his back straight and his expression serene. The guards, a vital part of his royal procession, played their role with unwavering precision. As the king approached the courtyard, he could already see the familiar figures of the royal guard standing in their usual formation. They were positioned perfectly, in two neat rows, facing each other. The guards were statuesque, their eyes trained straight ahead, hands stiff at their sides. King Charles was accustomed to this sight. He knew the drill, just as the guards knew theirs. A silent salute would be exchanged, and he would continue on his way. It was a small, almost insignificant moment in the grand scheme of the day, yet it was a moment that filled him with a quiet sense of pride. But on this particular morning, something felt different. There was an undeniable energy in the air, an unspoken tension that seemed to hang over the palace grounds. It wasn't immediately obvious, but if you looked closely, you could see it in the subtle movements of the staff, the way the guards stood just a little straighter, as if they were bracing for something. For a moment, King Charles considered that perhaps it was just his imagination running wild. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He took a deep breath, as if trying to steady himself. The cool morning air filled his lungs, and the familiar scent of the gardens, a mix of roses, lavender, and freshly cut grass, calmed his mind. This was his moment to collect his thoughts, to feel grounded before the day ahead. As he began walking toward the royal guard, he made a mental note to himself that everything would proceed as it always had. The guards would salute. He would nod. They would exchange a moment of mutual respect, and then he would continue his walk as planned. But as he moved closer to the guards, something began to feel off. At first it was just a small detail. The guards weren't standing quite as still as usual. Normally their faces were completely impassive, their eyes forward, locked into a state of military precision. But today their expression seemed different. There was a slight shift, a flicker of something in their posture. King Charles couldn't put his finger on it, but it was enough to make him pause for a split second. He tried to push the feeling aside. It's nothing, he thought to himself. They're just focused. But as he moved closer, the unease only deepened. The guards didn't move their heads as they usually did, their eyes never briefly meeting his. They remained unmoving, their faces stern. The familiar rhythm of the salute didn't come. It was a small thing, but in that moment the king's heart rate quickened. He had seen the royal guard perform this ritual thousands of times before. So why, today, did it feel different? King Charles continued walking, his steps slow and deliberate, trying to maintain the air of confidence that he had always carried. Yet the silence around him felt louder than ever before. The usual crisp sound of boots clicking in perfect synchrony seemed to echo in his ears. But today it was replaced by an unsettling quiet. As he approached the first row of guards, he was expecting the familiar gesture, a sharp salute, a slight nod of the head, and then he would be on his way. But instead, the guard closest to him remained still, their eyes locked straight ahead, not even a hint of recognition. It was as though the king wasn't even there. King Charles hesitated, unsure of what to do next. His heart was still steady, but his mind was racing. What had happened? Why were the guards, usually so disciplined, so cold? It wasn't just the lack of a salute, it was the atmosphere itself. A quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air as though everyone knew something that he didn't. Something was wrong, and the king could feel it deep in his bones. King Charles continued walking slowly toward the royal guard, his eyes now scanning the faces of the men and women who stood in formation. He had seen them every day of his life, standing tall, unwavering in their discipline. But today it was as if they were all in a trance, locked in some kind of stillness that felt far too deliberate. At first he told himself that it was nothing. Perhaps the guards were just focused on their duty. Maybe something had distracted them, or they were waiting for some signal. But the longer he walked, the more uncomfortable he felt. The usual exchange of glances and slight nods of acknowledgement simply wasn't happening. As he took another step, he noticed something even stranger. The guards, normally so rigid and composed, weren't even making the slightest movement. Not a single finger twitched. It was as though the entire line of guards had turned into statues, frozen in place, their faces blank and serious, without a hint of the respect that was usually offered to him. King Charles couldn't help but feel a small knot form in his stomach. The closer he got to the front of the line, the more unnerving it became. He could see the muscles in their faces tense, as if they were straining to maintain their unblinking gaze. He had always admired their unshakable discipline, but now, their stillness felt unsettling. His heart began to beat a little faster. What was going on? Why were they acting like this? He tried to maintain his composure, walking with the same calm, steady pace that he always did. This was nothing, he thought, just some small mistake or distraction. After all, it was only a brief salute. He had seen these guards perform this gesture countless times before. It was the same routine day in and day out. But today, it felt as though the very foundation of that routine had cracked. King Charles took another step forward, now just a few feet away from the first guard. He expected to see the usual swift movement of the soldier's hand rising to his brow in salute, a crisp acknowledgement of his presence. But nothing happened. The guard's eyes stayed fixed forward, his face as still as stone. The king's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. This was not normal. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the silence. It was the feeling that the guards, who were supposed to embody loyalty and strength, were now refusing to give him the respect he had always received. A sense of coldness washed over him. The usual warmth that came with the simple ritual of passing the royal guard had vanished. Now all he could feel was the weight of their silence, as if the very air around him had thickened with tension. Each step he took brought him closer to an uncomfortable truth, that something was different today. His gaze flicked from one guard to another, hoping to see a familiar expression. Perhaps one guard would offer a brief apologetic glance. Maybe one of them would move, acknowledging the king's presence. But no, they were all completely unmoving. It was as if they were not even aware of him walking past. King Charles felt his throat tighten, and for a moment he almost stopped in his tracks. Was this some kind of mistake? Was there something wrong with him? Why was this happening? As he walked past the line of guards, he tried to steady his breath. His usual confidence began to falter, replaced by a growing unease that he couldn't shake off. He had been through countless ceremonies, attended state dinners, and faced difficult political challenges. Yet nothing had ever made him feel quite as unsettled as this moment did. The silence was deafening, and the more he tried to make sense of it, the more distant and disconnected the guards appeared. He reached the end of the line and paused for a brief moment, still unsure of what he had just experienced. The guards remained perfectly still, their eyes locked in the same rigid forward stare. He gave a small nod, as he always did, hoping that this small gesture of acknowledgement would break the stillness. But the guards didn't budge. There was no response, no subtle movement, nothing. It was as though the world around him had stopped, leaving him standing there alone in his thoughts, unsure of what to do next. King Charles continued his walk, but now the weight of the silence seemed to follow him. He tried to push the strange feelings aside, telling himself that it was simply an odd coincidence. Perhaps the guards were distracted by something else. Perhaps they had simply misunderstood their duties for a brief moment. But deep down he couldn't deny that something had changed. It was as if the guards had turned into a wall of indifference, refusing to show even the slightest bit of recognition or respect. As he walked through the palace grounds, the thought gnawed at him. Was this just a minor mistake, or was it something more? Had something happened that had caused this break in the routine? Had he done something to cause this without even realizing it? King Charles had always been a careful and calculated leader, but now he found himself questioning his own actions. What had he missed? What had he overlooked? The palace, usually so full of order and tradition, suddenly felt alien to him. It was as if the very foundation of the royal rituals had cracked. He tried to shake off the growing feeling of unease, but it lingered. The walk, which had always been a calming routine, now felt heavy with an unknown weight. The sound of his footsteps echoed in his ears, and each stride seemed to carry him further into an unsettling silence. He passed the guards, the same still figures standing in perfect formation, their eyes fixed in front of them as though they had been waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The quiet stretched on, the moment stretching longer than it should have. King Charles felt the flicker of confusion turn into concern. He couldn't understand it. He had always prided himself on understanding the pulse of the palace. He knew when something was amiss, and yet today, he couldn't grasp what was happening. Why weren't the guards saluting him? Why had they in this one moment chosen not to acknowledge him? For a brief instant, he considered turning back and asking one of the guards what was going on. But as the thought crossed his mind, he quickly dismissed it. He didn't want to appear uncertain or unsure. He was the king, after all. He was supposed to be the one in control, the one who commanded respect with every step. And yet, here he was, feeling like an outsider in his own palace, confused by the behavior of those he relied on the most. As King Charles continued walking, he realized that the unsettling silence wasn't just about the guards. It was about the change in the air, the sense that something had shifted within the palace itself. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew that he would have to figure it out soon. The quiet disruption, small as it seemed, had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, and seeds once planted tended to grow. The king tried to shake off the unease and focus on the tasks ahead, but he couldn't help but wonder, what had happened to the royal guard, and what was going on behind the scenes of his palace? King Charles walked slowly, his mind still racing as he made his way through the palace grounds. The silence around him seemed to grow thicker with every step he took. His usual calm, confident demeanor was beginning to crack, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The royal guards, usually so disciplined and predictable, had left him feeling unsettled in a way he couldn't quite explain. They had ignored him, stood still like statues, and offered no sign of respect, something he had always relied on. He had been through countless ceremonies and public appearances, always surrounded by his loyal guards. This moment, however, was different. It felt like the usual rhythm of his life had been broken, and the silence hung over him like a heavy cloud. King Charles had always trusted in tradition. He had believed in the stability of the palace, in the order that had been maintained for centuries. But now, standing here, he realized that something was changing, something that went deeper than just a missing salute. His thoughts were interrupted as he neared the far side of the palace grounds. The weight of the moment seemed to press down on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't the usual feeling of being under the royal spotlight. No, this felt different. He had the distinct sense that he was being observed from the shadows, from a place where he couldn't quite see. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up and his pulse quickened. His mind was still trying to make sense of the guard's behavior, but now there was a new, darker layer to the tension. It was as if something or someone was waiting for something to happen. A shift in the air that was barely noticeable but full of significance. King Charles paused at the edge of the garden, his feet faltering for just a moment. He tried to push the feeling aside, telling himself that it was just the weight of his responsibilities clouding his judgment. It was a busy day, after all, filled with meetings, decisions, and plans. But the longer he tried to shake off the unease, the more it seemed to cling to him. What had changed in the palace? Why did everything feel off kilter? As he stood there, his thoughts whirling, the king's mind wandered back to the guards. He remembered how their faces had remained unmoving, their eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge him in any way. He had thought it was a mistake at first, perhaps some brief miscommunication or distraction. But now, as he replayed the moment in his mind, he realized that the behavior of the guards had not been a mistake at all. It had been deliberate. There was no accident in the way they stood there, silent and still. It was a clear, calculated choice not to salute him, and that thought sent a chill down his spine. The king's confusion only deepened when he considered the possibility that this was more than just an isolated incident. Perhaps it was a sign of something larger, something brewing beneath the surface that he had failed to see. He had always been aware of the palace's inner workings, the court politics, the power struggles, the whispers behind closed doors, but he had never thought that the royal guards, who had always been his most loyal supporters, would be involved in any form of rebellion or defiance. King Charles took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He had to think clearly. His mind was jumping to conclusions, making assumptions that were not based on any concrete facts. He needed to gather more information, to understand what was really going on. The last thing he wanted was to jump to conclusions and make rash decisions based on fear and uncertainty. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that something had shifted in the palace, something he could no longer ignore. He turned away from the garden, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone path. As he walked back toward the palace, his mind returned to the guards. He thought of the way they had stood in formation, completely unmoved by his presence. Their unwavering stillness felt like a sign, one he couldn't quite interpret, but one that felt important. The salute, or lack of it, had been small, yes, but in the world of royalty, small gestures could carry great meaning. The king's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a voice calling his name. He turned quickly, his heart still racing, only to see one of his aides approaching him. The man's face was a picture of concern, his usual calm expression replaced by a more serious demeanor. The king could tell that something was wrong. "Your Majesty," the aide said, bowing respectfully, "there is something you need to know." King Charles raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "There have been whispers," the aide began, his voice low and cautious. "Rumors, Your Majesty. They're circulating through the palace. There's talk of discontent among the royal guards." The words hit the king like a cold wave. "Discontent?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had always prided himself on his ability to maintain control over his palace, to know what was going on at all times. How had this slipped under his radar? "Some of the guards," the aide continued, "have been talking among themselves. There are concerns over recent decisions you've made. They don't feel heard, Your Majesty. They're frustrated." King Charles felt a knot tighten in his chest. "What kind of decisions?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The aide hesitated for a moment before responding. "There have been some changes to the structure of the royal staff, Your Majesty. Some guards feel that their roles are being undermined, that they're not being treated with the respect they deserve." The king's mind raced. He had made a few changes recently, minor adjustments to staffing, some new protocols, but he had never thought that these changes could lead to such dissatisfaction. He had always believed that his decisions were in the best interest of the kingdom, that they were necessary for the stability of the monarchy. But now, as he listened to the aide, he realized that his actions had not been viewed in the same light by everyone. "Is it widespread?" King Charles asked, his voice sharp. The aide nodded. "It seems to be growing, Your Majesty. Some guards are even saying that they will no longer stand for the way they've been treated. They're disillusioned." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. King Charles felt a rush of disbelief and frustration. How had this happened? How had things gotten to this point? He had always believed that the royal guards, with their loyalty and discipline, would never turn against him. But now he saw that there were cracks in the foundation, cracks that he had failed to notice until it was almost too late. For a moment, King Charles stood there, stunned. His mind struggled to grasp the full weight of what was happening. But as he looked at the aide, he realized that this was not just a small problem. This was something much bigger, something that had the potential to shake the very core of the royal palace. "We need to address this," King Charles said, his voice firm, his mind already racing with plans. "Immediately. Make it clear that this behavior will not be tolerated." The aide nodded, relieved to see the king taking charge. "Of course, Your Majesty." As the king turned and walked back into the palace, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads. The tension that had been building in the palace had finally come to a head, and now he had to make a choice. Confront the growing discontent head-on or risk letting it fester and destroy the very foundation of the monarchy.